Hi, welcome back to my channel, and today I thought I would talk about how to read a classic. This might seem like a very ridiculous and slightly obvious topic, how do you read a classic? You just open the book and read it. But I think classics are unique in the sense that a classic comes with like a huge amount of text surrounding the text that you might be interested in. So when you pick up just a modern book, you might be able to read some reviews. But there are not going to be like this massive amount of critical articles about this book, and it doesn't come with an introduction. It usually doesn't come with any footnotes. There are a lot of extra materials that surround a classic text. And it sort of raises the question, how should you approach them? What do you prioritize? Where do you start? Where do you go? And these are the questions that I'm going to be talking about just from my personal perspective. Obviously, everyone approaches these things completely differently, and I think that's great. I'm just going to share how I approach a classical text and how, there are different methods of how you could do so. Usually when you buy a classic of literature, you usually end up either with an Oxford Classic or Penguin Classic. There are also some like cheaper editions like Dover Thrift, etc., but I think most common it'll be either a Penguin Black Spine or Penguin Modern or an Oxford edition. And both of these editions usually come with quite an extensive academic introduction, as well as usually quite a lot of footnotes. In terms of the introduction, they are usually aimed at about college level, and they are often meant to give you a little bit of a scholarly background into the text that you're reading. So the things that they will include are things like a very brief overview of the author, perhaps a little bit of context in what kind of literary tradition the author is writing. It'll also discuss some of the topics that will be part of the book, and it usually provides a little bit of criticism as well as where to go for further reading if you want to study this text more. It's really important to know that a scholarly introduction doesn't care about spoilers. They will often discuss details from the plot and it will reveal all. It often actually assumes that you've already read the work. Even though it's an introduction, it already assumes very often that you know the context and that you know sort of the basic plot at the very least. Which also means that if I want to read a classic for enjoyment, if I'm not studying it, I think if you're studying it, then the introduction can be very helpful. But if I'm just reading a classic for fun, I just skip the introduction. I usually don't even look at it. I sometimes feel like even if I know sort of the rough structure of the story, for example, Romeo and Juliet, I think that is one of those stories that is very difficult to spoil because just in terms of our cultural consciousness, I think most people know how it ends. So for a text like that, I might read the introduction, but often because they will do close reading of some very specific sections, I usually prefer to still have actually read the entire work before I enter into any sort of scholarly work on that work. But at the same time, I also think it can be really helpful to at least have a little bit of a context for a book that you're reading. For example, maybe you're going into a new territory. You have no idea anything about perhaps the time, the place, maybe you're reading from a different culture that you're not particularly familiar with. Something that I do, and it's going to sound absolutely ridiculous, just read the Wikipedia page of the author specifically. I know everyone looks down on Wikipedia and you're always told, don't use Wikipedia as a source, etc., etc. However, honestly, Wikipedia is a wonderful tool just because it's really accessible. Because where the introduction of a lot of classic editions, like the Penguin or the Oxford, are written at quite a high level, Wikipedia is so much more accessible. And if Wikipedia uses a term that you are not familiar with, the name of some sort of group of writers or something, you can just easily click on it and just get like the gist of what they're trying to say. Whereas sometimes in a scholarly introduction, you're just a little bit like, well, I've never heard about any of these things, so this doesn't actually help me in any sort of way. Of course, Wikipedia isn't perfect. Also, it doesn't really provide a huge depth of information, but especially if you just want to know like the highlights. Give me the highlights of the 19th century. Give me the highlights of who Dickens was and what he cared about. Then I think Wikipedia is really great. And what's also helpful is usually, don't come at me if this isn't the case for one specific case. But usually when you read the Wikipedia page of the author, it will contextualize their work, but it usually doesn't really contain very specific information about the plot of certain books. So if you are reading for enjoyment and you don't really want to get spoilers, I actually think that is a great way of going at it. You will have to be a lot more careful with the page that actually discusses the book in depth, because that is often the place where they will include summaries, etc. Then there's also, of course, the question of footnotes, because a lot of these editions will include footnotes where you have to sort of look in the back and look up extra information on the text, and often it's historical notes, explanatory notes. It can be quite broad. Now, I have a little bit of a hot take relating to this, and that is that I try to often just not read the footnotes. I honestly feel like the footnotes can often take away from the flow of the text if I have to be leaping back and forth from whatever story I'm reading, especially with fiction, and then have to read these sort of dry explanatory historical notes. I honestly just kind of lose track and lose sight of the story that is being told to me. And there's just a lack of flow, and I never really feel like I really get into the story. Of course, this brings up the question, like, what do you do if the text is just really, really difficult and it's hard to understand what's even happening while you're reading it? Then you might decide that actually for you, footnote reading is brilliant and exactly what you need. What I usually do though is to just keep reading and accept that I might not get everything out of this text just from first reading. Sometimes when I just keep reading, things will become clearer, or you just get more used to the language that the author is using, especially if you go further back in history. Sometimes it just sort of becomes clear eventually. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes perhaps I will have to put the book down and actually look up some terms because I just have no idea what's actually going on. But I think there's a lot of value in actually experiencing the book as a holistic whole, rather than sort of experiencing it through fragments and also having these additional pieces of information. And often the footnotes are quite didactic, they are not written in the style of the book. Again, this might not be something that bothers you at all, but I found that for me, often when I read a classic, I kind of want to experience it the way it was intended to. I want to read it like people in whatever time period it was published in, how they would read it, without having really too many preconceived notions in terms of perhaps interpretations from other scholars. Like, I don't really want to have those in the back of my mind before I've even touched the book. That's not to say that I don't think footnotes are useful. I actually think they are very useful, but I do think a lot of footnotes are usually aimed at people who are studying this text, not just reading it for enjoyment or reading it out of curiosity. It's very much aimed at people who are taking a course in university and who will probably be writing an essay about this book. What I sometimes do is to actually just read the footnotes after my reading session. So, I might read 3 chapters of a Charles Dickens book, and then when I feel like I'm done for that day, I will go back to the notes and just sort of peruse the footnotes at the back to sort of see whether there's something I missed, whether there was something extra information that I might find interesting. And I often find that there's usually not much that is absolutely essential to my understanding of a book. I also think that there is an art to the footnote. There is this perfect balance between giving enough information but not giving too much information. I think sometimes a lot of books do this perfectly wonderfully, and a lot of editors put so much care and so much work into footnotes. However, I read books where just every other sentence is a footnote. And I just think that's a little bit too much. I also think, it's an interesting question. How much knowledge do you assume in your reader? I have, for example, once started reading a book that put a footnote next to Big Ben and told me, this is a clock tower in London. I think, honestly, for someone who has very, very basic knowledge of London, this footnote was just completely unnecessary. But still, that is something that, I saw the little number, I leafed to the back, I was like, oh, what are they telling me about Big Ben? And then they were like, oh, it's a clock tower. I'm like, yes, I knew that, thank you. But that moment interrupted my reading, and I think that is something I personally try to avoid. Maybe this is information that you do need, particularly if the text is just so difficult or just so far away from your experiences. I can easily imagine that if I were reading, for example, a text about, let's just say, Istanbul, I have no idea about any of the buildings in Istanbul, so even something as simple as that would actually be a useful footnote for me. So it's probably important to consider whether you already have a lot of knowledge about the subject. For example, I don't really read the footnotes in 19th century works anymore because I just already know enough to get on with most 19th century texts in English literature. But I would read the footnotes in other books, particularly if I'm reading, 16th century or like really far back, which is just not something that's really within my realm of knowledge. One thing that I also like to keep in mind, even as someone, who has a PhD in English literature, sometimes texts just aren't easy. Sometimes you just don't really understand what the author was referring to, what's happening. There can be an amount of confusion, and I think that should be normalized, and that's fine. It's fine not to understand every single part of a novel. Because when we think about modern novels, there are plenty of modern novels that are really complex, confusing, dense, but we never really think like, oh, that means that I am lacking in knowledge. We just think, no, the author is just being dense on purpose. And authors, even in history, were sometimes just dense on purpose. Sometimes the density and the obscurity is just an artistic choice. One little tip that I would recommend if you struggle with the language specifically, so it's not really the content that's the issue, it's the language. For those texts, I would recommend listening to an audiobook while also reading the text itself. I find this really helpful, especially because the reader is already parsing the sentence for you, so it's already putting emphasis in certain places without you having to decipher, where the sentence is going for yourself, especially with really long sentences. It can be really helpful to just have someone else put the right emphasis on the right, the cadence of the sentence is so much more clear when someone is actually speaking it to you. Overall, though, I think the best way to read a classic, how do you read a classic, is however you like. Whatever works for you is the correct way to read a classic. I personally, for example, don't read the introduction. I usually avoid the footnotes. Sometimes I use, for example, a Project Gutenberg ebook because they don't have footnotes, and then I just don't get distracted by the little numbers all the way in the text. I like to look up information sometimes, but I will look it up online because it's easier and I will have a bit more control over whether or not it contains spoilers. Then, if I finished a book, I will often read the introduction afterwards, because then I feel like I actually know what they're talking about, and I feel like I get a lot more out of the scholarly introduction if I have just finished the book. But I would love to hear how you approach a classic. Do you read the introduction? Do you do research beforehand? Do you just dive straight in? Do you read every single footnote? I would love to hear, because I feel like this is a topic that I don't really hear a lot of people talking about. We talk a lot about the content of the classic. We talk a lot about the content of the classic, but we don't really talk a lot about how do you do this thing. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting to you and made you think a little bit about how you approach reading a classic, for example, if you read classics. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you again soon. Bye.